The summer of 1974 was supposed to be perfect for the Hartwell family. Richard, a successful insurance broker from Tampa, had promised his wife Margaret and their two young children, David and Sarah, a memorable vacation exploring the Florida Keys. They'd chartered a small Cessna from Coastal Airways, eager to see the chain of islands from above before settling into their beachside resort. The pilot, Captain James Murphy, was experienced and well regarded, with over 15 years of flying tourists through Florida's skies. On the morning of August 12, 1974, the Hartwells arrived at the small airfield just outside Tampa. Margaret clutched her camera, excited to capture aerial shots of the turquoise waters below. 10-year-old David bounced with anticipation, while 8-year-old Sarah pressed her nose against the terminal window, watching planes take off and land. Richard checked his watch, confirming their 9 a.m. departure time with Captain Murphy, who seemed relaxed and confident as he performed his pre-flight checks. The weather was ideal, with clear skies and gentle winds. Air traffic control cleared them for takeoff at 9:15 a.m., and witnesses later recalled seeing the white Cessna 172 climb steadily into the morning sky, banking south toward the Keys. The flight plan called for a scenic route along the coast, with an estimated flight time of just over 2 hours. They were expected to land at Key West International Airport by 11:30 a.m., where a rental car would be waiting to take them to their hotel. But 11:30 came and went, with no sign of the Hartwell family. By noon, airport officials were making calls. By 1 p.m., search and rescue teams were mobilized. The Coast Guard launched boats and helicopters, scouring the waters between Tampa and Key West. Civil Air Patrol volunteers joined the effort, flying grid patterns over the Everglades and Gulf of Mexico. For 3 weeks, the search continued relentlessly, covering thousands of square miles of water, swampland, and dense vegetation. Richard's business partner, Tom Bradley, coordinated with authorities and hired private investigators. Margaret's sister flew in from Ohio, desperately hoping for news. The local newspapers ran daily updates, and the story even made national headlines. "Family of 4 vanishes on charter flight," read the headlines, accompanied by photos of the smiling Hartwells taken just days before their departure. Despite the massive search effort, no trace of the aircraft was ever found. No debris, no oil slicks, no distress signals. Captain Murphy's impeccable safety record only deepened the mystery. The Cessna had been recently serviced and certified airworthy. Weather conditions had remained favorable throughout the morning. There was simply no explanation for what had happened to Flight N4739C and its 5 occupants. As weeks turned to months, the search was eventually called off. The Hartwell house in Tampa stood empty, neighbors keeping watch over the property. Richard's business was sold to pay debts and legal fees. Margaret's garden grew wild and overgrown. The children's rooms remained exactly as they had left them, beds unmade, toys scattered on the floor, as if they might return at any moment. The aviation community was baffled. Experienced pilots analyzed every detail of the flight plan, weather reports, and Captain Murphy's background. Some theorized about mechanical failure, others about pilot error or medical emergency. A few suggested more sinister possibilities, including hijacking or deliberate crash. But without wreckage or witnesses, these remained only theories. The Federal Aviation Administration launched its own investigation, interviewing everyone who had contact with the flight that morning. Ground crew members, air traffic controllers, and other pilots were questioned extensively. The Cessna's maintenance records were scrutinized. Captain Murphy's personal life was examined for any signs of distress or unusual behavior. Nothing emerged to explain the disappearance. As 1974 became 1975, then 1976, the Hartwell case slowly faded from public attention. Other tragedies captured headlines, other mysteries demanded investigation. But for those who knew the family, the questions never stopped. Richard's colleagues would sometimes gather at their old lunch spot, wondering what had become of their friend. Margaret's book club kept her chair empty for months, hoping she might somehow return to discuss the latest novel. The children's school held a memorial service, planting a tree in the courtyard with a plaque bearing David and Sarah's names. Their classmates would sometimes pause there, remembering their friends and wondering what adventures they might have shared if fate had been different. Teachers spoke of David's love for baseball and Sarah's talent for drawing, keeping their memories alive even as years passed. Local aviation enthusiasts continued to speculate about the disappearance. Some believed the plane had crashed in the dense Everglades, where wreckage could remain hidden for decades. Others thought it might have gone down in the Gulf of Mexico, sinking in deep waters where recovery would be impossible. A few held on to hope that somehow the family had survived and was living somewhere under assumed identities, though this seemed increasingly unlikely as time passed. The case officially remained open, but resources were limited and leads had long since dried up. Detective Ray Morrison, who had coordinated the initial investigation, would occasionally pull out the file, reviewing witness statements and flight records, hoping to spot some detail that had been overlooked. But the evidence was frustratingly sparse, offering no clear direction for continued investigation. Margaret's sister, Linda, hired a private investigator in 1976, convinced that someone, somewhere, must know what had happened to her family. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Carl Brennan, approached the case with fresh eyes and modern techniques. He interviewed witnesses again, analyzed financial records, and even consulted with psychics, though he placed little faith in their pronouncements. Brennan's investigation revealed some interesting details that had been missed earlier. He discovered that Captain Murphy had been having financial difficulties, with significant gambling debts to some unsavory characters. There were also questions about his relationship with his ex-wife, who had accused him of erratic behavior in their divorce proceedings. But these revelations, while intriguing, didn't provide concrete answers about what had happened on that August morning. The investigator also uncovered discrepancies in the flight plan and fuel records. The Cessna had been loaded with enough fuel for the planned route, but Murphy had apparently requested additional fuel at the last minute, enough for a much longer flight. When questioned, the fuel attendant remembered the request, but couldn't recall Murphy's explanation for the extra fuel. This discovery led Brennan to theorize that Murphy might have deviated from the planned route, either voluntarily or under duress. Perhaps he had been forced to fly to a remote location, or maybe he had planned to disappear with the plane and passengers for reasons known only to him. But without the aircraft or any witnesses to its final moments, these remained only speculation. As the investigation continued, Brennan also learned about unusual insurance policies that Richard Hartwell had purchased just weeks before the trip. The policies were substantial, covering not just accidental death, but also disappearance. This raised uncomfortable questions about whether Richard might have been involved in his own family's disappearance, though friends and colleagues insisted this was impossible, describing him as a devoted family man with no apparent motive for such a drastic action. The insurance companies, meanwhile, were reluctant to pay out the policies without proofs of death. They conducted their own investigation, hiring forensic accountants to examine Richard's finances and private detectives to verify the circumstances of the disappearance. Their findings largely corroborated what authorities had already discovered, but they too noted the unusual timing of the policy purchases and the substantial payouts they would provide. As 1977 arrived, the case seemed to have reached a dead end. Brennan's investigation had uncovered intriguing details, but no definitive answers. The insurance companies remained in legal limbo, neither paying out the policies nor formally denying the claims. The Hartwell house was finally sold, the proceeds held in trust pending resolution of the case. The story might have remained forever unsolved, another aviation mystery to puzzle enthusiasts and investigators. But sometimes, the wilderness gives up its secrets in unexpected ways. And in the summer of 1983, nearly 9 years after the Hartwell family vanished, a chance discovery in the remote Everglades would finally begin to provide answers to questions that had haunted so many for so long. The morning of June 15, 1983, started like any other for Jake Whitmore, a veteran alligator hunter who had been working the deeper reaches of the Everglades for over 20 years. Jake knew these waters better than most, navigating the maze of channels and hammocks with the skill of someone who had learned every twist and turn through decades of experience. He was checking his lines in a remote area known locally as Devil's Garden, a particularly dense section of swamp that few people ever visited. As Jake pulled his shallow draft boat through the murky water, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another piece of debris, maybe an old oil drum or discarded appliance that had somehow found its way into this remote location. But as he drew closer, his experienced eye recognized something that made his heart race. Partially submerged beneath a tangle of cypress roots and Spanish moss was the unmistakable shape of an aircraft wing. Jake had heard the stories about the missing family, like everyone else in South Florida. The disappearance had been big news, and even 9 years later, people still talked about it occasionally. Now, staring at what was clearly the wreckage of a small plane, he felt a chill run down his spine, despite the oppressive heat of the summer morning. He secured his boat and waded through the knee-deep water, pushing aside the vegetation that had grown over and around the wreckage. The plane was a Cessna, he could tell that much, though the registration numbers were obscured by mud and algae. It sat upright in the shallow water, its landing gear buried in the soft muck of the swamp floor. The impact had been severe, but the aircraft was remarkably intact, protected by the dense canopy of trees and the soft landing provided by the swamp. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his radio. He had found missing boats before, even a few cars that had been driven into the swamp and abandoned. But this was different. This was potentially the answer to one of Florida's most enduring mysteries. He called the Collier County Sheriff's Office, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This is Jake Whitmore out in Devil's Garden," he reported. I think I found that plane that went missing back in '74. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the remote swamp location was buzzing with activity. Sheriff's deputies, Federal Aviation Administration investigators, and Coast Guard personnel converged on the crash site. Detective Morrison, now a captain but still haunted by the unsolved case, was among the first to arrive. The aircraft was indeed N4739C, the Cessna that had vanished with the Hartwell family and Captain Murphy. The registration numbers, once cleaned of mud and growth, confirmed what everyone already suspected. After 9 years, the mystery of their disappearance was finally beginning to unravel. But as investigators began their careful examination of the wreckage, they discovered something that would complicate the case rather than solve it. The plane was empty. There were no human remains, no luggage, no personal effects. The seats were there, torn and waterlogged but intact. The instrument panel was damaged but readable. But of the 5 people who had boarded this aircraft on that August morning in 1974, there was no trace. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the plane ended up in this remote location, miles from its intended flight path? Where were the passengers and pilot? Had they somehow survived the crash and made it to safety, or had something more sinister occurred? As the investigation team worked to extract the aircraft from its watery grave, they began to piece together clues about its final moments. The damage pattern suggested a controlled crash landing rather than a catastrophic failure. The landing gear was extended, indicating that Captain Murphy had attempted to land the aircraft rather than simply falling from the sky. Fuel lines were intact, suggesting the plane hadn't run out of gas. The instrument panel told its own story. The altimeter was stuck at 500 feet, and the compass pointed northwest, away from the Keys and toward the vast expanse of the Everglades. Whatever had happened, Captain Murphy had clearly deviated from his planned route, flying deep into the wilderness before attempting an emergency landing in the swamp. But the most puzzling discovery came when investigators examined the aircraft's interior more closely. On the floor behind the pilot's seat, they found something that would send shockwaves through the investigation. The message was clearly deliberate, etched by someone who had time and reason to leave a desperate plea for help. But who had written it and who was coming? The discovery transformed the case from a simple aviation accident into something far more complex and potentially sinister. As news of the discovery spread, the media descended on the story with renewed vigor. The mysterious message in the plane captured public imagination, spawning theories ranging from hijacking to organized crime involvement. The Hartwell family's disappearance, which had faded from public memory, suddenly became front-page news again. Detective Morrison found himself back in the spotlight, fielding calls from reporters and amateur investigators, all eager to solve the mystery. The case file, which had gathered dust for years, was suddenly active again. Old witnesses were re-interviewed, and new leads were pursued with fresh urgency. The discovery also reopened old wounds for those who had known the family. Margaret's sister Linda, now remarried and living in Georgia, flew to Florida as soon as she heard the news. Standing at the edge of the swamp where the plane had been found, she wept for the family she had lost and for the answers that remained just out of reach. But the investigation was far from over. The empty plane was just the beginning of a mystery that would prove even more complex and disturbing than anyone had imagined. The investigation into the Hartwell family's disappearance was far from over. The discovery of their empty plane in the Everglades with its cryptic message had transformed what seemed like a tragic accident into something far more sinister. As 1983 drew to a close, law enforcement agencies across Florida found themselves grappling with a mystery that defied conventional explanation. Detective Maria Santos of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement had been assigned to lead the reopened case. A seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience, she'd seen her share of strange cases, but nothing quite like this. The carved message, "Help us," and "They're coming," haunted her thoughts as she pored over the evidence files in her cramped office in Tallahassee. The physical evidence was perplexing. The plane showed clear signs of having been submerged for years, yet the message carved into the interior panel appeared relatively fresh. The forensics team had confirmed that the carving was made with a sharp metal object, likely a knife or similar tool. More disturbing was the pattern of scratches around the message, suggesting it had been carved in desperation or fear. Santos had requested all available records on the Hartwell family, and what she discovered painted a picture of a seemingly ordinary middle-class family from Tampa. Richard Hartwell, 43, was a successful insurance broker with no known criminal connections. His wife, Margaret, 39, was a part-time librarian and active in their church. Their children, Susan, 16, and David, 12, were both honor students with no history of trouble. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, Santos began to uncover troubling details. Richard's business had been struggling in the months before the disappearance. Several clients had complained about delayed claim payments, and there were whispers of financial irregularities. The insurance policies he'd purchased just weeks before the flight were substantial, far exceeding what would be considered normal for a family of their means. The pilot, Frank Morrison, presented another puzzle. His background check revealed a clean record, but Santos discovered that Morrison had been heavily in debt at the time of the flight. His charter business was failing, and he'd been facing foreclosure on his home. The $30,000 found in his bank account 3 days before the flight had no clear source. Santos decided to revisit the crash site. The remote location in the Everglades where the plane had been found was accessible only by airboat or on foot through treacherous swampland. As she stood beside the corroded aircraft, now covered with a tarp pending further investigation, she tried to piece together what might have happened in those final moments. The plane's position suggested it hadn't crashed, but had been deliberately landed or placed there. The landing gear was intact, and there were no signs of impact damage. It was as if the aircraft had simply been abandoned in the swamp and left to sink slowly into the muck over the years. Local wildlife officials confirmed that the area was known to alligator poachers and drug smugglers who used the isolated waterways to transport their illegal cargo. Santos began to wonder if the Hartwell family had somehow become entangled in criminal activity, either voluntarily or as unwitting victims. The message carved into the plane's interior became the focus of intense scrutiny. Handwriting experts compared it to known samples of the family members' writing, but the results were inconclusive. The desperate nature of the carving made it difficult to determine who had written it or when. Their coming suggested the family had been aware of some impending threat. But who were they? And why had the family been in the Everglades in the first place? The original flight plan had called for a scenic tour of the Florida Keys, nowhere near where the plane was ultimately found. Santos interviewed everyone who had known the family, searching for any hint of what might have driven them to deviate from their planned route. Margaret's sister revealed that Margaret had seemed unusually anxious in the weeks before the trip, mentioning that Richard had been receiving strange phone calls at odd hours. The calls always seemed to upset him, and he'd become secretive about his business dealings. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Santos received a call from a retired Coast Guard officer named James Wheeler. Wheeler had been working Marine patrol in the area during the late 1970s and early 1980s, and he remembered something that might be relevant to the case. "I always wondered about that plane," Wheeler told Santos during their meeting at a waterfront diner in Naples. "See, we found wreckage of a small aircraft in that same general area back in '78, about 6 months before your family disappeared. But when we went back the next day to investigate, the wreckage was gone." Wheeler's revelation opened up a new avenue of investigation. Santos began looking into other aircraft disappearances in the region, and what she found was disturbing. Over a 10-year period, at least 7 small planes had vanished in the same general area of the Everglades. Most had been dismissed as accidents, pilot error, or weather-related incidents, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Working with federal aviation authorities, Santos mapped out the disappearances and found they clustered around several remote islands and channels deep in the Everglades. The area was known locally as the Maze due to its confusing network of waterways and small islands. It was the perfect place to hide illegal activities. The breakthrough came when Santos interviewed a former drug enforcement agent named Carlos Mendez, who had worked undercover operations in South Florida during the height of the cocaine trade. Mendez had heard rumors of a sophisticated smuggling operation that used small aircraft to transport drugs from the Caribbean to remote landing strips in the Everglades. They called it the pipeline, Mendez explained. Small planes would fly in low, under radar, and land on these makeshift strips carved out of the swamp. The drugs would be transferred to boats and moved up to Miami and other cities. But the operation was protected by people in law enforcement, politics, even aviation. Santos felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. The Hartwell family's chartered flight had somehow intersected with this criminal operation. Perhaps they'd witnessed something they shouldn't have, or maybe Richard's financial troubles had led him to become involved with the wrong people. The insurance angle became even more suspicious when Santos discovered that Richard had been in contact with a man named Victor Castellanos in the weeks before the flight. Castellanos was a known associate of several Miami drug cartels and had a reputation for solving problems for people who owed money to dangerous organizations. Phone records showed multiple calls between Richard and Castellanos in the days leading up to the flight. The conversations were never recorded, but the timing suggested they were connected to Richard's mounting debts and the pressure he was facing from his business troubles. Santos theorized that Richard had been forced to participate in some kind of smuggling operation to pay off his debts. The scenic flight to the Keys was a cover story. The real destination was somewhere in the Everglades, where they were supposed to meet with Castellanos and his associates. But something had gone wrong. Maybe the family had tried to escape, or perhaps they'd witnessed something that made them too dangerous to let go. The message carved into the plane suggested they'd been held somewhere before their ultimate fate was sealed. The investigation was complicated by the fact that many of the key players were either dead or had disappeared themselves, and Castellanos had been found murdered in Miami in 1985, his body dumped in Biscayne Bay. The pilot, Frank Morrison, had vanished completely after the flight, and no trace of him had ever been found. Santos spent weeks interviewing former law enforcement officers, aviation workers, and anyone else who might have knowledge of the smuggling operation. Slowly, a picture emerged of a vast criminal network that had operated with impunity throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. The network had included corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, from local police to federal agents. They'd used their positions to protect the smuggling routes and eliminate anyone who posed a threat to the operation. The Hartwell family appeared to have been collateral damage in this larger criminal enterprise. As 1984 began, Santos knew she was close to solving the case, but she also knew she was walking into dangerous territory. The people responsible for the Hartwell family's disappearance were still out there, and they'd already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The message carved into that plane panel took on new meaning as Santos realized it wasn't just a cry for help from the past. It was a warning about the present, a reminder that some secrets were worth killing for, and that the truth about what happened to the Hartwell family was still buried somewhere in the dark waters of the Everglades. The case had evolved from a simple missing persons investigation into something far more complex and dangerous. Santos knew that finding the truth would require her to navigate a web of corruption, violence, and cover-ups that reached into the highest levels of power in South Florida. But she was determined to give the Hartwell family the justice they deserved, no matter the cost. As she prepared for the next phase of her investigation, Santos couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As the investigation into the Hartwell family's disappearance deepened, the pieces of evidence began painting a picture far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The cryptic message found inside the submerged aircraft, the deliberate nature of the landing, and the mysterious carvings discovered at the crash site all pointed to something that went beyond a simple accident or even isolated criminal activity. Sheriff Martinez stood in the makeshift command center, surrounded by walls covered in photographs, maps, and evidence bags. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the assembled team of investigators. Detective Reynolds from the state police had arrived with additional resources, and FBI agent Collins was coordinating with federal databases to cross-reference the pattern of disappearances they'd uncovered. The breakthrough came when they realized the Hartwell case wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past 2 decades, 17 small aircraft had vanished in the same region of the Everglades. Most were never found, their disappearances attributed to the treacherous conditions of the swamp. But when investigators began mapping the locations where wreckage had been discovered, a disturbing pattern emerged. Each crash site was positioned along what appeared to be established smuggling routes. The aircraft weren't randomly distributed across the vast wetlands. They were clustered around specific waterways and landing strips that had been used for decades by criminal organizations moving drugs, weapons, and worse through South Florida. The Everglades, with its maze of channels and virtually impenetrable interior, had become a highway for the kinds of people who preferred to operate in the shadows. Agent Collins spread aerial photographs across the conference table, each marked with red pins indicating known crash sites. The pattern was unmistakable. These weren't accidents. These were eliminations, carefully orchestrated to silence witnesses or eliminate competition. The Hartwell family had stumbled into something they were never meant to see. The investigation took on new urgency when they discovered that Captain Murphy, the pilot who had taken the Hartwells on their final flight, had been receiving payments from a shell company based in Miami. The company, registered under a false name, had been funneling money to several charter pilots operating out of small airfields throughout the region. In exchange, these pilots were providing transportation services that went far beyond scenic tours. Detective Reynolds had been working the phones, following paper trails that led through a labyrinth of dummy corporations and offshore accounts. The money always seemed to disappear into the same black hole, but the pattern of payments suggested a sophisticated operation with connections that reached into legitimate businesses and possibly even law enforcement. It was during this financial investigation that they uncovered the most chilling detail yet. The shell company making payments to Captain Murphy was also connected to a series of real estate transactions in the area. Properties were being bought and sold at prices that made no economic sense, unless you understood that the transactions were actually money laundering operations disguised as legitimate business deals. One name kept appearing in these transactions: Vincent Torino, a businessman who owned several marina and charter operations along the coast. On paper, Torino appeared to be a successful entrepreneur who had built a small empire of waterfront businesses. But when investigators dug deeper, they found connections to known criminal organizations and a history of suspicious activities that had somehow never resulted in charges. The surveillance footage from the marina where Captain Murphy had kept his plane revealed something that made everyone's blood run cold. In the weeks before the Hartwell family's disappearance, Murphy had been meeting regularly with men who fit the description of Torino's associates. The meetings were brief, always conducted in the evening when the marina was nearly empty, and always ended with Murphy receiving an envelope. But the most damning evidence came from Murphy's own logbooks, recovered from his apartment after a warrant was obtained. Hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer, investigators found a second set of flight records that told a very different story from the official logs he had filed with the FAA. These secret records showed that Murphy had been making regular flights to remote locations in the Everglades, often at night, carrying passengers who weren't listed on any manifest. The flights followed the same routes that legitimate tour operators use during the day, but the timing and circumstances suggested something far more sinister. The coded entries in Murphy's hidden logbook matched dates when other aircraft had disappeared. It appeared that Murphy hadn't just been transporting criminals and their cargo, he had been involved in the elimination of witnesses and potential threats to the operation. The Hartwell family's scenic tour had been a cover story for something much darker. As the investigation team pieced together the timeline, a horrifying picture emerged. Captain Murphy had been contacted by Torino's organization and instructed to eliminate the Hartwell family. The reason remained unclear, but evidence suggested that John Hartwell, despite his seemingly ordinary life as a Tampa businessman, had somehow become a threat to their operation. Financial records showed that Hartwell's construction company had been bidding on contracts related to marina development along the coast. It was possible that he had discovered something about Torino's businesses that he wasn't supposed to know. Perhaps he had seen something, heard something, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The method of elimination was as calculated as it was cruel. Murphy had taken the family on what they believed was a pleasure flight, but had instead flown them to a remote location where they were killed and their bodies disposed of. The aircraft had then been deliberately crashed and submerged to make it appear as though the family had died in an accident. But something had gone wrong with the plan. The message found inside the aircraft suggested that at least one member of the family had realized what was happening. The evidence of the deliberate landing indicated that the aircraft hadn't simply crashed. It had been brought down in a controlled manner, possibly by someone fighting for their life. The investigation revealed that this wasn't Murphy's first involvement in such activities. Cross-referencing the dates in his hidden logbook with missing person reports showed a pattern of disappearances that stretched back over a decade. Families, individuals, and even other pilots who had gotten too close to the truth had simply vanished, their disappearances attributed to the dangerous conditions of the Everglades. The scope of the criminal operation was staggering. It wasn't just about drug smuggling or money laundering. This was a systematic elimination network that had been operating with impunity for years, protected by corruption, intimidation, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the swamp. As word of the investigation spread through law enforcement channels, other agencies began coming forward with information. The DEA had been tracking suspicious activities in the region for years, but had never been able to connect all the pieces. The Coast Guard had reports of unusual aircraft movements that correlated with known smuggling operations. Even local fishing guides had stories of areas in the Everglades where they had been warned never to go. The Hartwell family's disappearance had exposed a network of corruption and violence that reached into every level of South Florida society. Marina owners, charter pilots, real estate developers, and even some law enforcement officials had been either directly involved or had chosen to look the other way in exchange for money or threats. Sheriff Martinez realized that bringing down this network would require resources and expertise far beyond what his department could provide. The investigation had evolved from a missing persons case into a federal matter involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, and the danger to everyone involved was very real. The evidence room at the sheriff's department had become a fortress of documentation, each piece of evidence carefully cataloged and cross-referenced. The walls were covered with photographs, timelines, and connection maps that looked like something from a crime thriller. But this was real life, and the consequences of failure weren't just professional embarrassment, they were life and death. As the sun set over the Everglades, casting long shadows across the water, the investigation team prepared for what they knew would be a long and dangerous journey toward justice. The Hartwell family deserved answers, and the community deserved to know the truth about what had been happening in their backyard for so many years. The swamp had kept its secrets for decades, but now those secrets were finally being dragged into the light. The question was whether the investigators would be able to expose the full extent of the conspiracy before those responsible could eliminate the evidence and disappear into the same watery maze that had claimed so many victims. The case had transformed from a tragic mystery into a race against time, with the lives of investigators and potential witnesses hanging in the balance. The search had stretched into its fourth month when a piece of evidence surfaced that would transform everything we thought we knew about the Hartwell family's fate. Deep in the Miami-Dade archives, a cold case detective named Maria Santos was cross-referencing unsolved disappearances from the late 70s when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The same Victor Torino, who'd been linked to the Hartwell case, had appeared in at least 7 other missing persons reports spanning from 1973 to 1981. All involved families or individuals who'd vanished after taking charter flights over South Florida. Santos immediately contacted the FBI task force that had formed around the Hartwell investigation. What they discovered was a pattern so methodical and so chilling that it redefined their entire understanding of what had happened in those treacherous waters. Torino wasn't just a businessman with criminal connections. He was the architect of what investigators would later call the Everglades Network, a sophisticated operation that used charter flights as cover for something far more sinister than simple drug trafficking. The network operated with surgical precision. Torino would identify targets, usually families with modest wealth or individuals who posed threats to the organization's operations. The targets would be approached through legitimate-seeming businesses, often offered scenic flights or business opportunities that seemed too good to pass up. Murphy wasn't just a pilot caught up in something bigger than himself. He was a key recruiter, using his charm and aviation expertise to lure victims into what they believed were routine flights. But here's where the investigation took its darkest turn. The families weren't just killed, they were systematically disappeared, their identities erased, their assets quietly transferred through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The children in these families, including young David and Sarah Hartwell, weren't collateral damage. They were the primary objective. The network was trafficking children, using the remote locations of the Everglades as staging areas before moving them through a pipeline that stretched from Florida to points unknown. Detective Santos uncovered financial records showing that Torino had purchased several properties throughout the Everglades in the mid-70s, all under different aliases. These weren't just hideouts. They were processing centers, places where families could be held, separated, and their fates decided based on the network's needs. The most chilling discovery came when Santos found insurance policies that Torino had taken out on several of the missing families, including the Hartwells. The policies were dated just weeks before their disappearances, suggesting a level of premeditation that turned the stomach of even the most hardened investigators. The cryptic message found in the Hartwell plane suddenly made perfect sense. John Hartwell had figured out what was happening. Maybe he'd seen something he shouldn't have, or maybe he'd started asking too many questions about Torino's business dealings. The message wasn't just a cry for help. It was a warning about an operation that had been running for years, claiming dozens of victims who'd simply vanished into the vast wilderness of South Florida. As the task force dug deeper, they discovered that the network had connections reaching far beyond Florida. There were links to similar operations in Louisiana, Texas, and even parts of Mexico. The Everglades weren't just a dumping ground, they were a crucial hub in a trafficking network that spanned the entire Gulf Coast region. The families who'd been disappeared weren't random victims. They were carefully selected based on specific criteria that made them valuable to the network's operations. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when investigators realized that the network was still active. The evidence suggested that while Torino and Murphy might be dead, the infrastructure they'd built was still being used. Recent disappearances in the region showed similar patterns, similar methods, similar outcomes. The families who'd vanished in the 70s weren't just historical victims. They were the early casualties of an operation that had evolved and adapted, continuing to claim lives decades after its original architects had been eliminated. The search for the Hartwell family had uncovered something far more horrifying than a simple plane crash or even a straightforward murder. It had exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight, using the legitimate aviation industry as cover for crimes that defied comprehension. The vast wilderness of the Everglades, which had seemed like the perfect place to hide evidence, had instead become a repository of clues that were finally leading investigators toward the truth. Santos and her team realized they weren't just investigating a cold case anymore. They were uncovering an active criminal conspiracy that had been claiming victims for decades. The Hartwells weren't just a family who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were casualties of a war that most people didn't even know was being fought, a conflict between those who would exploit the innocent and those who would protect them. As the investigation expanded, involving federal agencies and international law enforcement, the scope of the network became clear. The Everglades disappearances were just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a criminal enterprise that had tentacles reaching into every corner of the legitimate world. The families who'd been taken weren't just victims of random violence. They were casualties of a system that treated human lives as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded when they were no longer useful. The search for answers about the Hartwell family had become something much larger and much more urgent. It had become a race against time to dismantle a network that was still active, still claiming victims, still operating in the shadows of a world that had forgotten too many of the people it had lost. The truth about the Hartwell family's disappearance runs deeper than anyone imagined. What started as a missing persons case has revealed a labyrinth of corruption, human trafficking, and organized crime that extends far beyond a single family's tragedy. As investigators continued to unravel the network, they discovered that the operation had been running for decades, using small charter flights as cover for their illegal activities. The Everglades, with its vast, inaccessible terrain, provided the perfect hiding place for evidence and victims alike. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts, funding operations that spanned from Florida to Central America. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began connecting dots that had been scattered for years. Similar disappearances, previously dismissed as accidents or isolated incidents, suddenly formed a pattern. Families like the Hartwells weren't random victims. They were carefully selected targets, chosen for reasons that investigators are still trying to understand. Captain Murphy's background revealed connections to military contractors and private security firms, suggesting the network had access to sophisticated resources and training. Vincent Torino's business empire served as a front for money laundering operations that funded everything from drug smuggling to human trafficking. The children's pipeline that investigators uncovered was particularly disturbing evidence of systematic exploitation that had been operating under the radar for years. The warnings left in the Hartwell plane weren't just desperate messages from a dying family. They were breadcrumbs leading to a much larger truth. The controlled landing, the arranged supplies, the careful staging of the scene, all pointed to a level of organization that required significant planning and resources. This wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals, but of a sophisticated network with deep pockets and powerful connections. As the investigation expanded, federal agencies joined the effort, bringing resources and expertise that local law enforcement simply couldn't match. The case became a multi-jurisdictional operation with task forces dedicated to following the money, tracking the missing persons, and dismantling the network piece by piece. Every lead opened new avenues of investigation, revealing connections that stretched across state lines and international borders. The corruption extended into law enforcement itself, with evidence suggesting that some officials had been compromised or complicit in the cover-up. This made the investigation particularly challenging, as investigators had to be careful about who they trusted and how they shared information. The network's ability to operate for so long without detection suggested they had protection from within the system. For the families of the victims, the revelation that their loved ones were part of a larger conspiracy brought both relief and anguish. Relief that there were finally answers, but anguish over the systematic nature of the crimes and the possibility that their family members had suffered greatly before their deaths. The knowledge that this wasn't random, that their loved ones had been specifically targeted, added another layer of trauma to their grief. The investigation also revealed the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. The messages left by the Hartwell family, the careful documentation of their captivity, and their attempts to leave clues for investigators showed remarkable courage and presence of mind. Even in their darkest moments, they were thinking of others, trying to prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. As law enforcement agencies continue their work, they face the challenge of not just solving past crimes, but preventing future ones. The network's sophisticated operation methods, their use of technology, and their ability to adapt to law enforcement pressure make them a formidable opponent. Each breakthrough in the investigation reveals new layers of complexity and new challenges to overcome. The Hartwell case has become a symbol of the ongoing fight against organized crime and human trafficking. Their story, tragic as it is, has already led to changes in how missing persons cases are investigated and how different agencies share information. Their sacrifice, unwilling though it was, has contributed to efforts that may save countless other families from similar fates. Today, investigators continue to follow leads generated by the Hartwell evidence. Every piece of information they left behind continues to yield new clues, new connections, and new hope for justice. The network they exposed is still being dismantled, with arrests and prosecutions ongoing. The fight for justice continues, fueled by the determination to honor the memory of the Hartwell family and all the other victims who suffered at the hands of this criminal organization. The swamps of Florida may have tried to hide the truth, but they couldn't silence the voices of those who refused to disappear without a trace. The Hartwell family's story is far from over. It's become part of a larger narrative about justice, corruption, and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of overwhelming darkness. Whelming darkness, whelming darkness, whelming darkness, whelming darkness, whelming darkness, whelming darkness.